So Maud Milner, Annette Young, Odessa Platt, Ethel Davis, Catherine Calvelage. Those were the first women elected to office in Erie County, Pennsylvania. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Speggen and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. And in this conversation, the first part of a new series, we will be looking at the trailblazing women in Erie County, Pennsylvania, who sought to serve the public through elected office and in turn made history, reviewing the positions they held and the impacts they've made. From municipal offices to state level positions, you'll find out about the women who made and are still making history through Erie County in this multi-part series led by our own Jefferson Educational Society Scholar in Residence, Dr. Judith Lynch. Now, Dr. Lynch has begun writing about the history of Erie County's elected women. Her writings are available for free download at jeserie.org. Now, a bit about Dr. Lynch before we dive in. She's an elected woman herself, elected Erie County woman herself. She started her time at the Jefferson Educational Society as the first chair of the think tank's Board of Trustees and remains on that board today. She served as the inaugural director of the Jefferson Civic Leadership Academy in 2015 and was named the Jefferson's Decadian Scholar in 2018. Now, among her many accomplishments, she spent time in academia, serving as an associate professor of political science and history at Mercyhurst University, and prior taught at Allegheny College, where she was also a part of the Civic Engagement Institute there. She was, as mentioned, an elected Erie County woman herself, a 5-term county executive in Erie, and was instrumental in drafting the Erie County Home Rule Charter. Dr. Lynch also worked as an analyst for the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and taught 13 years at Villa Marie High School. She received her doctorate with distinction in political science in 2001 from the University of Pittsburgh and her master's degree in social studies from Gannon University. Her undergraduate degree, a bachelor's in history in political science, is from George Washington University. In this conversation, we're going to turn our attention to those trailblazers, examining Dr. Lynch's first piece, available at jeserie.org. That first piece, Early Women Leaders Reflect Nationwide Struggle. It is the first in her series, and it is available now. A second installment will be coming out shortly, and we look for future installments to come out after that. We'll be here having the conversations around those pieces weekly, Wednesdays at noon, and of course, those videos are available to stream on demand afterwards. Now, since this program is first airing live on the JES Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comment section below. Now, if you're watching a later broadcast or listening to a later broadcast of this event, please still feel free to send us your questions, and we'll do our best to get those along to Dr. Lynch. And of course, for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please visit jeserie.org and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Dr. Judith Lynch, thank you for joining me for this conversation.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you, Ben, for having me.
So Dr. Lynch, first, I just want to thank you for writing this series. I know I asked you, I gave you the unenviable task in the past of trying to cover all of this content in an hour, hour and a half, all of Erie County's elected women. And you did such a wonderful job at that. And now we have a moment here as we are continuing to celebrate 100 years of accomplishment since the signing of the 19th Amendment, or the 20th Amendment, in 1919. Giving women the right to vote and unpacking Erie's history around that. So I wanted to thank you. Your work is ensuring that history is told and studied in full. So we are grateful for you, for your contributions. Before we get to those trailblazers, though, that I mentioned in the intro, the first elected women in Erie County, Pennsylvania, I want to rewind that clock 100 years or so and head back to September 9th, 1919, when the 20th Amendment is passed. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Tell us a little bit about the lead up to the passing of that monumental amendment, the organizations that were championing, what it looked like in the early days, Judy.
Well, I think there are a couple things here that I want to make straight. I think the amendment to the National Constitution was adopted on September 18th, and that is 1920, and that was the 19th Amendment. Now, two things I think should be made clear so that there is no confusion. and that is when you amend the Constitution of the United States, or you amend the Constitution of the state of Pennsylvania or any state, it needs to be ratified. It needs to be ratified. So the ratification, the 36th state, which was what was necessary, a majority of the states, came in September the 18th, 2020. So that is the ratification of the 19th Amendment that made the 19th Amendment legal in the United States.
And Judy, what were some of the organizations championing that? What did that look like, the lead up to getting to that moment, as we're looking at that as a nation, and who is involved, how is it involved, state level, national level? What is that conversation?
Well, Ben, this is something I am just trying to get a handle on now, because it's become patently clear to me that nothing comes out of the thin air, that there are things that come before that are pushing certain activities or actions. And so if you go all the way back to the Civil War and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and what it was, of course, it was giving the rights of citizenship to African Americans, but males. Females, of course, did not have the right to vote. But in all of this discussion surrounding these amendments, certainly the right to vote was uppermost. And because the African men would have the right to vote, while women throughout the rest, maybe the North or whatever, would not have the right to vote. That certainly was a movement that had an impact. Another one was the Prohibition movement. Now we know that that was something that came out of the late 1880s, and the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was an organization that was formed, and it was pushing for a national amendment again to the US Constitution to forbid the sale of alcohol. But this was, even though it didn't pertain to suffrage, it was something that galvanized women and pushed them together and make them think of themselves as a unit and politically active and politically, strong enough to get a prohibition amendment. Now, there were many other organizations that came into existence, but those were largely based in churches, like the Methodists or the Unitarian Church, that were also very conscious of the need to push for a way in which women would be part of the political realm of the United States.
And we'll see some of that unpacking. And I want to apologize earlier for flipping some of the numbers in my head here and moving around. But I know one number I do have right, Judy, is 1913. And I want to look at 1913 in Pennsylvania, because that's one of the things that you talk about in your first writing, is the lead up to what the state of Pennsylvania is doing in terms of marching toward the women's vote for the 19th Amendment. But tell us what Pennsylvania looks like in 1913, please.
Well, one of the things about the suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement, is it bifurcated into two groups. And one of the groups concentrated on state by state getting a state amendment passed, and then it had to be ratified by all of the counties. So if we look at the state of Pennsylvania, this was occurring in 1913. So the state legislature was being pushed by women and women's groups in order to pass an amendment to the state constitution that would allow women to vote. Now that eventually failed. It failed by just 1 or 2 votes. But in doing that, women also had to be very conscious of the fact that they had to get ratification of the amendment county by county, and they began to organize to get that done. And of course, one of the things that was just so brilliantly, I think, concocted was to get a copy of the Liberty Bell, which was a symbol of the U.S. Constitution, and to get that Liberty Bell on a conveyance that took it from county to county. And the people then coalesced talking about the need to give women the right to vote. And this raised again the consciousness. So one of the things we need to know is if you're making a pot of stew, it takes a lot of things to throw into that stew in order to get the proper concoction. And that was exactly what was happening with the women's movement and the passing of an amendment, whether it would be to the state constitution, which was eventually given up, okay, or the national constitution, which eventually prevailed. It took a tremendous amount of effort and percolation and all sorts of ways in which to raise people's consciousness about, hey, women don't have the right to vote. They are second-class citizens. African men, yes, were given the right to vote. How about women, and all women having the right to vote?
And Judy, I want to get to the first elected women, but we are talking about the right to vote there. And I don't want to skip over some of the important early names we see here in Erie County, Pennsylvania. We see Mabel Woodward Wright, Augusta Fleming, and Jane Ware Presley. They played a critical role in Erie County. What were they doing in the lead up to that push here locally for us in Erie County?
They were organizing women. They were bringing to the attention of women the need for the right to vote and how, in fact, that was going to occur, whether it would be through a state effort or whether it was through a national amendment. And they raised the consciousness. Now, what we have to do as historians is we need to flesh out these women's lives and understand a little bit about their backgrounds and what led them in this direction to become the leaders of this movement. But even before the League of Women Voters was founded or the Zonta Club was founded, these women were out there working in order to get suffrage for women.
Right, in the Zonta Club, as you mentioned, they had their first official meeting in Erie County on November 8th, 1919. And we see the League of Women Voters in Erie County being founded in 1920, but there is work that is happening before that to get us to that point. I want to fast forward a little bit in our timeline. Although the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, it wasn't, though, until 1923 that the first women were elected to major offices in Erie County. In that year, we learn of the name Maud Milner, thanks to you in your first installment in this series. So tell us about her before we get into Annette Young, another early elected woman in Erie County.
Well, I think it's interesting that it took a couple years from the passage of the National Amendment in order to get women to the point where they were ready to run for elective office. And this occurred in 1923, while the 19th Amendment passed in 1920. But there was a tremendous amount of work that had to be done. Women had to be convinced that this is the path to equality. They had to be then enrolled as a voter, registered to vote. And then if, in fact, there was anybody so inclined, they had to be encouraged to throw their hat in the ring, to think of themselves as being elected officials or able to be elected as an official in the county or the townships or the boroughs or wherever.
So Judy, if I could just stop for a minute and I guess ask, let's go back and look at that gap, that 3-year gap between 1920, when the 19th Amendment passes, and then to 1923 in Erie, where we see those first early elected women in Erie County. In your research, is this common? Was Erie an outlier? We were late to the game, or were we early in terms of electing women? Because you just talked about how much women were working on the lead up to the passage of that amendment. And then we see that gap. We see a 3-year gap before anybody runs for office. Certainly women are voting in between then. But are we seeing women run for office earlier in other parts of the country? Are we seeing that Erie's on par with when women begin running for office and are elected? Or were we in ourselves trailblazers early as Erie County before perhaps other places? Did you get a sense of that in your research?
Well, I don't have the complete information, obviously, but in my opinion, we were probably on par with other communities. And that, it isn't as if you pass an amendment and therefore everything happens automatically. It doesn't. And in those 3 years, the League of Women Voters was founded and organized, and the Zonta Club was founded and organized. And then organizations like the Women's Temperance Union and church organizations, the Unitarian Church, became tremendous factors also. So it took time to build the momentum to get to the point where women were not only voting now, they're voting, but they're running for office.
And that's what I would have assumed. So I appreciate your confirmation there on that, Judy. And I'm sure that's something we're going to look at as we continue the series. Where does Erie stack up? How does Erie stack up? Because I know one thing that, we had talked about, and this is fast forwarding way into the future of our history, that Erie at the same time had 2 women in chief executive roles, both you as county executive and Joyce Savacchio as mayor. And I know we've talked about that wasn't all that common to see at municipal government level, 2 women heading up that. And we know that a lot of time passes between when we're talking about now and when that happens. But I don't want to lose sight of Maud Milner. So let's go back to her as treasurer of the city of Erie. Take us back to that first case.
Ben, I'm interrupting you. I know. I do want to go back to 1931 and say, okay, the first woman that ran for what they called a directive office, meaning a policy-making office, was Helen Sherlock. Okay, and that was in 1931.
And that's and we sorry, Judy.
She became the first county commissioner in the whole state of Pennsylvania. There was not a single county commissioner ever elected before Helen Sherlock that was a woman.
And we meet Helen just at the end of your first piece that you have introduced, and we get to know Helen much better in your second piece, which I'm excited that is going to be available on the Jefferson website, JES Erie, very soon, where we get to talk about her. So thank you for that note. Take us back though to 1923. Let's start at our beginning as Erie County. Tell us about Maud. Tell us about Annette Young as well. Both looking at the treasurer position and the clerk of courts, in that distinction too of a policy-making position versus a non-policy making position, but still an elected office.
Right. Maud Milner, and that information is taken largely from Carney's Erie Politics. Now, he misspells her name. And so I think it's very important to say it's not Miller, it's Milner.
Milner with an N.
N, okay. Millar with an A. Millar, okay. So it's Maud Millar, Maud with an E. And at any rate, she had worked in the treasurer's office for 19 years. And there was a vacancy then in the treasurer's office, and she decided to run for office. Now, she ran against somebody, I believe, who was very popular. He was a fire chief. His name was Cronin. And I have received an email from a descendant of his. And I'm sure that he was well-versed in Erie politics. He certainly knew the fire department, but she knew the treasurer's department. She had worked there for 19 years. And she won a very close election, very, very close election.
In fact, we see mail-in ballots playing a role in early elections. Tell us a little bit about that in terms of the vote count.
Okay. In the day that they voted, so they count the votes and then they announce the outcome. But the next morning's paper said too close to call, that they could not call this particular race because it was neck and neck, and they were saying that there were still something like 52 ballots or 42 mail-in ballots that had not been counted. When I saw that, of course, given what we are going through today, it was kind of hilarious. That was 1923. And when the final count was made, and if anybody really wants to spend a good day, they could go down and watch at the courthouse as they count. And as the voting comes into the courthouse. But at the end, she won, and the mail-in ballots actually were not counted at the time she was proclaimed the winner, because she won by 54 votes, and I believe there were 42 mail-in votes. So they figured that there wasn't sufficient number to make any difference in the election outcome. And she had won the election. Now, what's critical here is she was very, very well positioned to be the treasurer, which is extremely important. But she had served in that position not as in the elected position, but in an appointed position for 19 years. She knew the treasurer's office. And I think the people of the city of Erie made a very wise choice in selecting her.
And we see that in the city of Erie, and right about the same time for the county, though, we see Annette Young become the first woman elected to a county position, and we see her taking a county seat as the clerk of courts for Erie County. Tell us a little bit about Annette Young and her path to victory.
Well, I think another thing that we should understand, along with the treasurer's office, the clerk of courts is a clerical operation, and it is extraordinarily important, but it is primarily clerical. It is not policy making. You're not directing a large number of employees. Now, she had served, Annette Young has served as the deputy clerk of courts. And when the clerk of courts, his name was Ross Cutter, her boss, when he died, then the governor, who was Governor Sproul at that time, came in and appointed Annette Young to the position of clerk of courts. So she had an appointed position, but the question is that would be for a few months, and then there would be an election. And she made the decision to throw her hat into the ring and become a person seeking an election for this position. She was very, very active in the Republican Party. She was active in women's groups. She was well known throughout Erie County. And this is probably one of the reasons why she was able to win.
And I like how you frame of putting her hat in the political ring. And Dr. Lynch, I want to take a pause here to take a question that we have in our comment section from the audience, wondering, were women trying to run for office in Erie County before the passing of the 19th Amendment? Did we see anybody, because these are clearly the first elected women, did your research find anyone that tried to run before the passing of the 19th Amendment, or were these the first campaigns by women as well, and the first campaigns turned out to be successful?
Now, one of the women's leaders, and I can't remember exactly who, I'm going to say Susan B. Anthony, wanted to test to see if she could become an elected official. And so she actually filed all the paperwork, and then she was fined. And she wasn't thrown in jail, but it certainly was considered a crime because she was a woman and not eligible to run for elective office.
Right, and that's maybe something that we can dig into, in future publications or see any research, if we can turn up anybody in Erie County to know of, because I know the one that pops into my mind who ran and won was Jeanette Rankin in Montana, for the House of Representatives. I think it was 1916 she ran and was elected. So we do know that at least nationwide, women were running before women had the ability to vote, and in an all men voting block voted Jeanette Rankin in. We know that happened, but I want to keep us moving.
But Ben, if I could stop you for just a minute, and that's because this country is so large and it is so diverse in its laws. Okay, Now, even though it took a national amendment to give women the right to vote, women in the West had the right to vote many, many years before the 19th Amendment was passed. And that is because their state constitutions gave them the right to vote and the right to serve in political office. Now, I'm not sure this Ms. Rankin, whether you said Montana, whether Montana was one of these states that had that women had the right to vote. Because as the country progressed and moved westward, it became freer. And therefore, when the constitutions were created and the areas came into the United States, many of them gave the right to vote to women. And they came in after the Civil War.
And that's a great distinction, and I appreciate you pointing that out, Judy, because that's something I think that not many people, myself included, know in terms of when states were having the right to vote versus the nationwide appeal to be able to vote, even though it would be an office serving, in the federal government. So a great distinction there in terms of the lead up there, seeing that certain states had that right before nationwide, women would have that right with the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1920. But let's head back to Erie County. Let's take a look at Odessa Hunter Platt Odessi. Now, she has an interesting path to office that you note in your first write-up, because she first fills her husband's seat. Tell us about her path to victory for elected office, because this is, again, a different and interesting path, and you cover that quite well in your first write-up.
Well, the Plates were from Corey, and I think this is important. And they moved to Erie. He had a very profitable business in Corey, but he opened a similar business. It was newspapers, and I would think it would be just all sorts of things that he sold out of this particular facility. Unfortunately, the Mill Creek flood came along and destroyed his whole operation. His name was Ferdinand. And what Ferdinand decided to do, because he had been very active in the Republican Party, and he decided then to run for a position, and it would be recorder of deeds. And he was successful, he was elected, and probably the reason he was successful was not only his prominence in the Corey area, his prominence in Erie, but his time spent with the Republican hierarchy. He was a very good party member.
And one of the things that stuck out to me when you were covering the Plates and you were covering Odessi in that section was one of the quotes that you came upon, and I wanted to share that here in this program, where she's on the campaign trail, and she is talking to a woman, meeting one-on-one, and the woman expresses some reservation, and Odessi, the woman's making a pie, and Odessi turns to her and says, "Make your pie, I'll watch you. I'm sure you make a much better pie than I do, but then I can do a good job for you as recorder of deeds." And I think that that's a remarkable exchange and interplay between the two. Tell us a little bit about that quote. Unpack that for us, Judy.
Okay, now Odessa Platt came from a political background. Her husband and her Republican background. And at that time, the best type of campaigning, and it's still, in my opinion, the best type of campaigning, is door-to-door, person-to-person. You have to talk to the person, you have to acquaint them with yourself, your background, and you have to ask them for your vote, for their vote. And that's exactly what she was doing, and she was doing it in a way that really built on a relationship. Oh, you're making a wonderful pie. I wish I could make that type of a pie. My pie's not going to turn out like yours, such a good pie, but I can be a good recorder of deeds. I can do the job.
And it's a good reminder of what it takes to campaign and ways to campaign, and like you said, that press the flesh moment of door to door and getting a chance to meet constituents and connect with them to earn votes there. Certainly important then, still important now. So she was elected to recorder of deeds in 1927, and then, as you note, reelected in 1931. But in the following election, in 1935. Following her victory of getting reelected for that office again, she was running against another woman. And then that's where we first meet Catherine Calvelage, a Democrat who won the election in 1935. What were conversations like then in the media? A woman running against a woman for the position, women representing the top of their party at the ballot for that, a Republican woman who is an incumbent, a Democratic woman who's a challenger. What was the conversation like then? What was the media like? And how did Erie process this culturally? What did that look like then, Judy?
Okay, now we are sitting right now at a time when there's tremendous confrontation between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. We're in the midst of this election like it's never been before. But the 1930s also brought similar contention between the two parties, the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. And one of the reasons, of course, was the Great Depression. We have the coronavirus, but the Great Depression brought Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Democrats to the national stage. And they had a mission. They wanted to change the United States in a way in which it had not been, particularly in this area and some of the Midwest. And so there was this tremendous give and pull. But by 1935, the country in this area was in the deepest part of the Depression. And there were just thousands and thousands of people who were no longer employed, who were roaming the streets or on the rails or in the woods, children without food, families without wherewithal. And so it probably was an election in which this environment spilled over. And so Odessa Platt was a Republican. She had come up through the Republican ranks. And so this is between a Republican view of the country and a Democratic view of the country. And Catherine Calverley won.
And one of the other Democrats we see emerge, as you said, ushered in by the effects and impact of the Great Depression, the rise of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the president. Another woman that we see is Ethel Davis, and Ethel tosses her hat into the political ring. But she's running for a seat that had been occupied by a woman. Annette Young decides she's not going to run for another term of clerk of courts. Tell us a little bit about Ethel Davis and what we learn about her.
So Ethel Davis is a longtime employee of the courthouse, and she has worked in this office for many, many years under an elected official, a woman elected official. When she decides not to run, then Ethel Davis throws her hat into the ring and says, even though she's of a different party, and there's no doubt from what you read that Ethel Davis was very highly connected to the Democratic Party, and that she felt that she could carry the mission of the Democrats into this particular office, although the office itself is a clerical operation, and everything has to be done according to code, and it isn't really something that party makes a difference at all.
And one of the things that we see with both of the Democrats we just mentioned, in 1939, with both Catherine Calverley and Ethel Davis, we see their advertisements leaning away from declaring themselves as politicians and really emphasizing that they're not politicians or that they're seen as public servants. I think it was Ethel Davis you mentioned leans in on being a public servant in her campaign and advertisements. Why do we see these two candidates moving toward that message? Because I think that the reverberations of that in history we see today of politicians still saying, I'm not a politician, I'm a servant, or don't think of me as part of the politician. And by gosh, Judy, we're even dealing in a time when we hear phrases like drain the swamp, the idea that DC would be a swamp and that we must get all of the swamp creatures. And I think that translates to career politicians out of the area. But in 1939, we see two politicians saying, well, I'm not a politician first, I'm a public servant, or I'm something else. So why was this their message then? Why was this the path that they wanted to take to election?
I think that was particularly true of Catherine Calverley. And by 1939, of course, you had the war looming. The war in Europe had already started. Now, we certainly were not in the war. And Roosevelt was doing everything he could to keep the United States out of the war. but times had changed. Times had changed. And another thing, people had perhaps grown a little tired of the Democrats. And the word politician would carry a connotation, hopefully not of self-serving, but I wouldn't be surprised that people thought of these two people as having a great life, a good life, doing very little, having very little demanded from them, and getting a good salary, you know? And so one of the women, Catherine Calverleach, said, "Oh no, that's not me, I'm a servant," okay? Ethel Davis never really went that far. She was much more, I think, entrenched in the Democratic Party, but she did send the message out that she was above politics, okay? So by that time, politics had received kind of an opinion from the public that it wasn't of the greatest type of program that we could offer to the citizens. So what happened then afterwards, I'll let you explain it at the end of the election.
And I think what you're teeing up there, Judy, is I remember when we were first working on this presentation the first time, and I was looking at your slide deck, and I remember seeing it for the first time, and in bold at the top of the slide, you had "women beaten" in all capital letters. And I remember circling that and said, I got to talk to you about that. And I said, Judy, I see what you're saying in terms of they were defeated, but clearly we cannot say this. I don't think this is right. And you corrected me to say, aha, but this is what the papers printed at the time. This was actually how this was perceived. And I remember feeling such a gut punch and just groan-inducing feeling that this was the response, and that having a newspaper background myself, thinking that was a headline they chose to run, was that "women beaten," all capital letters. That just shocked me, Judy. And so tell us about that, the fallout, the impact, what that looked like then in the 1939 election.
Okay, "woman beaten" certainly impacted me in the same way as it did you, Ben. And the word "beaten," of course, refers to abuse, sometimes sexual abuse, where women have been for eons used as punching bags and have suffered tremendous abuse within the home. And so you had these two women who were both on the ballot as Democrats, okay? And of course, they were beaten in the election, fair and square, as far as we know, but there was a jubilance on the part of the Times when they saw the results of the election. And it wasn't that this woman lost or Miss Calverleach lost. It was that the women were beaten. They were put in their place. And from that time on, it became much more difficult for women to run for elective office. I think clearly that this carried the message that haven't we had enough women who have served in office? Now, finally, we're going to get rid of them. Women beaten.
And shocking. I mean, shocking and something we shouldn't tolerate. But, it's important to note that, because even in this discussion, we've not covered all that many women in terms of those who have held office, and that's a cultural response we're seeing at the time is, haven't you had your fill, which almost to me, pejoratively suggests, well, this was a cute experiment. Let's knock this off and get back to the way politics used to be, a retroactive application. And just, I that frustrates me, Judy. And I can't imagine how many other people are frustrated by that. And then understanding the setback in terms, because not only these two women are defeated in their election, that leaves just one woman then holding office at that time. And that woman is
Helen Sherlock. And Helen Sherlock was incredible as an elected leader. She was county commissioner, the first woman county commissioner in the state of Pennsylvania. And so we should be very proud of that. And her life is one that everybody could use as a model. Now, I just want to preface this too. with what happened in I believe the 1990s. And Joyce Savacchio can tell this story much better than I can. And she was riding on a kind of a float in a parade, and I believe it was in Harbor Creek, or I'm not even sure where the parade was. And all the women elected officials at that time were on the float. And I was there, she certainly was there, but there were many, many others. And some man came up and he said, "Oh my God, I didn't realize, we got to do something." So I have this feeling that women beaten has the same connotation. Haven't we had enough of this? Let's get on with the job now.
And it's startling to see that impact that many decades later, and then to wonder how far we are, now here we are in 2020, because, while we see more women running for office and we see more women being elected to office, it's still a very low number. Is it not, Judy? We're below 1/3 of representation, across the board, from federal government to state elected positions to county positions. These are not. We're still not seeing equitable service when it comes to men and women representing the people in the government. Even though we know that data shows us women vote more than men.
Yes, that's true. But remember, when we started, we talked about the Civil War and we talked about Prohibition. We talked about these currents, these waves that push change, okay? And I think that we are seeing one of those today. And if you look at the last election, particularly at the House of Representatives, you will see that a number of women, probably all-time record of women that were elected to office in the House of Representatives. So there is a change, and one of the things we have to recognize, more women vote than men, okay? And of course, there are more women in the United States than men, and that more women are graduating as doctors than men. More women are graduating as lawyers than men. Women are taking the top echelons of all the positions in the economic world. And it's just a matter of time. It's a matter of time. And so we should not become kind of disappointed that I go back and say Hillary wasn't elected. We shouldn't be overwhelmingly disappointed, because the time will come. It is coming.
Well, and I know you mentioned, specific careers, but I think I'm recalling it correctly, a slide from your initial presentation even pointed out that by the time that we get to next year, I think it's 2021 is what you had benchmarked, there would be nearly 150 for women for every 100 men graduating college, just college period, that we're seeing the number of women rapidly increase in terms of their educational attainment. Where we're actually seeing a decrease when it comes to men in their educational pursuits in attainment. So certainly the times, they are changing, and we're seeing a move toward that, but it still feels like it's taking quite a bit of time. Here we are 100 years later.
Mm-hmm. And Ben, I'd like to go back to 1923 when Maud Milner was running for treasurer, and they were having such difficulty counting the ballots because it was so close. And one of the things that was very profound and said openly, they had never had so many people voting. It was the first election where you really had the recruitment and the push to get women to the polls and to vote.
And Dr. Lynch, I think that is a uplifting note to wrap up the first part of this conversation. Are there any other big takeaways from the early years, from what's happening in Erie County to what's happening nationally in terms of the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1920, what that looks like? Any other takeaways that folks want to pay attention to in this episode before we move forward and welcome you back next week at noon on Wednesdays? We're going to be having these discussions, and we'll talk about that follow-up. We'll talk about moving along in our history. But takeaways here from the early years, aside from the one you just noted, which I think is critical for us to remember, the voter turnout to the polls in 1923 was higher than it had ever been.
Well, one of the things I guess as individuals we need to be cognizant of is there's nothing that's so enduring as change. And we are constantly going through change, and change has ways of amplifying certain currents or waves or elements of society, bringing women into the fold, increasing voting, or making certain issues of profound importance. So we're going through that right now, and we'll see what the outcome is.
Dr. Judith Lynch, a fantastic historian, an elected official yourself, and scholar residence here at the Jefferson Educational Society. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me for this conversation here on the first installment of your new series, Elected Women in Erie County, Pennsylvania. Thank you so much, Dr. Lynch.
Oh, thank you, Ben. Thank you very much.
And thank you to all of you watching along at home, tuning in to watch the live stream on the Jefferson Educational Society's Facebook page, or catching this broadcast at a later date when it's being replayed, re-aired on our website and our YouTube channel. A friendly reminder, we are going to be doing these programs live on Wednesdays at noon on the Jefferson Educational Society's Facebook page. You can tune in for those and see them as they're happening, or you can catch them at on-demand streaming available on our website, jeserie.org, as well as our YouTube channel. You'll also see plenty of other videos of past events that we've held at the Jefferson Educational Society during this digital programming. On our website, too, you'll find a whole host of publications, including the writing series that Dr. Lynch is working on for us, the history of the Erie County elected women. You'll find those installments there with plenty of other source material to read and keep you up to date. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Speggen. Thanks for listening and learning with us. Be safe, be sound.